Hey everyone, Wazoo here with another episode of Wazoo Web Bytes. Yeah, this is going to be great. Today we are going to be building a API from scratch using Rails, which will also handle authentication. Yeah, this will be really cool. Let's get started. As you can see, I've got a demo server running and we are going to be querying it with Postman to see how we can do it. Okay, so first of all, we've got to-do items that are in our service. So let's first try and do a fetch to get localhost 3000 /API /v1 to-dos. And let's go to the body. And we get a neat error back telling us that we need to sign in or sign up before continuing. So what I'm going to do is I am going to sign in. I have an existing user already. So we're going to set up Postman to handle a post request, and we're going to be going to /API /v1. So we are going to be signing in, and so we need to be going to /API /v1 /auth /sign_in. And we're going to be sending an email. Our user's email is user@user.com with a password of password. And let's go ahead and send that to the server, and we get a successful login. We get some bits of data back, along with the most important thing is we get a authorization header token back from the server. So now let's open another tab, and let's do a get localhost 3000 /API /v1 /todos, and in the headers of our request, we want to be sending the authorization header. So all we need to do is cut and paste it from the sign-in request and drop it in over here to our get all request. Let's make that response. And now we've got a whole bunch of to-do items coming back, all of them with movie titles. How about that? So we've got an ID for each one, we've got a title, we've got a status, and we've got is completed flag, along with a account ID for the appropriate account who owns this to-do item. So we've got quite a few coming back here. Okay, so we can also delete one. So let's just open up a new request window here. Let's make the same request. HTTP localhost 3000 /API v1 to-dos, and let's pick an ID from this list here. Let's try ID 21. So to-dos /21, and we'll change this request type to a delete. And we have to cut and paste our authorization header here again. So let's do that here. Headers, authorization, and paste that in, send. And we get a response back from the server, to-do successfully deleted. All right, that's pretty rad. Now let's try and get a to-do which doesn't exist. So let's go back to our get tab, and let's look for, well, to-do. We just deleted the to-do with ID 21. Let's try and fetch that one. Oh, you need to sign in or sign up before continuing. So you'll get that sometimes when the token runs out, and you'll have to re-authenticate. So let's sign in again with the same credentials. And we get a new authorization header in the response. So let's go ahead and cut and paste that. There. Now let's hit send, and unable to find the resource, and it gave us a status of 404. So it was not found. So we successfully deleted it earlier. Now that's really cool. So let's go ahead and we'll log in as the second user and just make sure that we've got a different set of to-do items. So we'll go back to our sign in tab. And for user, I think the second one is just user1 at user.com with the same password. Okay, and let's copy that bearer token header again. And let's do a get of all the to-dos and copy in our bearer header there, our authorization header. Hit send. And we get a different set of movies. We get Seven Samurai, Judgment at Nuremberg, There Will Be Blood, Catch Me If You Can, The Deer Hunter, Touch of Evil, Clockwork Orange, Hacksaw Ridge. These are all great to-do items. So it's more or less like a to-do item list of movies you either need to watch or you have watched. And yeah, that's about it for our demo. I think this is going to be a really exciting piece of work that we're going to be putting together in this video. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun. All right, let's get to it. Okay. Hey everyone, I'm now back on a terminal window. I'm using Windows 11, all the latest patches on the Insider build. Always a stable piece of software to be demoing stuff on, right? Actually, it has been really stable. I know I make jokes, but it's been incredibly stable compared to earlier versions. Okay, so I'm on the Windows subsystem for Linux 2. I'm using an Ubuntu shell, and so this should be compatible with Linux or Mac OS. I wouldn't recommend using this on plain Windows. I don't think Rails works very well on a plain Windows prompt, but maybe at the time of this recording, they've been able to fix all that, and then you can ignore what I just said. So at the very least, just make sure you've got Ruby. I'm using Ruby 2.7.5 for this video, and Rails. There is an interesting twist here. I know I'm using the latest. I do have the latest Rails version installed, 7.0.4, but we are actually going to be dropping down to Rails 6 for this project, just because we'll be making use of a lot of Devise gems, which are still migrating their way to a full 7.0 migration path. There's bits of them that don't seem to work too well with 7 without a lot of tweaking and jumping around, and so I don't want to have to spend some time in this video doing that when everything is kind of gelling together pretty nicely in version 6. So how we can do that is we can now type Rails underscore 6.1.7 underscore new, and let's call this Rails Authentication API. Or how about Rails API with authentication? That's a little bit more accurate. Okay, Rails API with authentication, and let's do a -t. We want to drop the automatic use of mini test files. We're eventually going to be adding RSpec to this, and we'll be adding --API, and that's just sort of a shortcut in the generator to produce a trimmed down version of the Rails engine for just working with APIs, which is what we're going to be doing in this project. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And that should spin everything up. Pretty cool. All right. So let's go into Rails API with authentication. All right. Pretty cool. All right. And by default, we are going to be using SQLite 3. That's the built-in database that ships with Rails Generator. This would equally work with other databases such as Postgres or MySQL. I think for the purposes of this video, we'll just keep it at SQLite. And maybe towards the end, I'll switch it. I don't know. We'll see how it feels like and see how long this goes on. Okay. So let's do a Rails S to start up the Rails server. And let's just make sure everything is up and running in our system without any issues. Localhost port 3000. And we should see the default, yay, you're on Rails page, which we do. Okay, so let's blow that up and let's go back to this. And we will stop this so we don't have anything up and running. Let's go into Visual Studio Code. Should make it a lot easier to see. Okay. Hopefully that's a big enough font size. Kind of difficult to tell sometimes in video. But we've got the same project structure that we do for regular Rails apps. We've got an app folder which contains controllers for our API. models, which we'll be adding our record or our models to, sorry. Views, we're not going to be using for this project. That's pretty much all we have to really worry about at this time. The DB folder, of course, contains our development test and production setup and configuration information, along with our databases themselves. Sorry, the configuration is down over in the config. Where is it? Here it is, database.yaml file. This is the configuration for our database, which allows us to set up different databases and credentials and even host names. So if you've got your development database locally, but then your staging or testing database is on a cloud somewhere, you can set it up this way to be able to do that. And we've also got a seeds file for our database, which we'll be playing with later. Our Gemfile, let's go into our Gemfile. So the Gemfile, if you're not familiar with Rails too much, is a sort of similar type of idea as package.json is to Node or JavaScript projects. This is sort of the tracking the dependencies that your application is using. All of this stuff is contained in the Gemfile. So as you can see right on top, it displays, or it contains the version of Ruby that generated this application. And that's one way for Rails to just make sure that whenever you port this code base to a different computer or work on it at a different time, that you're using the same version of Ruby that generated this project to begin with. Okay, and then we've got our list of gems. And then down here, we do have the ability to configure gems which are only for local development and testing, but won't show up when we want to deploy this application to a production environment. So some type of a cloud setting such as AWS. No more Heroku anymore, so we can't be deploying there anymore, unless of course you're paying for it. But let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set up a basic to-do item, which will track, as we saw in the demo, will track just basic attributes, such as a title, a status, and is completed. So let's go ahead and go back to our terminal window. And let's do a Rails generate or Rails G for generate, Rails generate resource, and then to do. And then we want to have a title, which is a string. We want to have a status, which is a string. And we want to have an is completed flag, which is a Boolean. So we can put that right on the command line. And it will go ahead and generate a controller for us, along with a model and a database migration, which is really handy. So first things first, what we want to do is we want to tuck that controller behind some proper namespaces. We want to convert this into a proper API. So in our controllers window, in our terminal window, let's go into a different terminal session. Let's go into our application API. Let's see. Let's blow that up a little bit more. Okay. So let's go into our app and into our controllers folder. What we want to do is we want to namespace our objects. We want to namespace our endpoints. We're looking to build a REST-based API, which means it's a API which can handle the create, read, update, and destroy requests coming from the web. So we'll be usually in a REST-based API. Your HTTP verbs that you're able to use maps to an action for your API object. So for example, for the create action, we normally use a post request For the read action, we normally use a get. For the update action, we normally use either a put or a patch, depending on what you're sending, where you're sending your request from. It either comes through as a put or a patch. And for the destroy action, we want to use a delete method, HTTP request method. So when you're constructing an API, usually you want to namespace your API. So this protects you going forward. Let's imagine that you've set up an API. You're a company, like you're a competitor to Stripe, right? The very popular Stripe API to manage payments and subscriptions and things like that. So let's say you're a competitor. You've set up your own API to handle requests for purchases, for subscriptions, etc. Now, let's say you launch, everyone is excited, you've built up a really great product, you launch to the market, and then a year later, you want to change the way some of your API operates. Let's say, like there's you've updated some of your infrastructure, or you've made a lot of other changes in your business model. And so you want to then reflect those changes with the API that you want to update. If you touch what's already existing in production that customers are using, then you risk breaking the existing API that customers are using, which would cause a lot of havoc for customers that are using your API, and they may no longer want to use your API. So the safest way, or a safer way, sorry, not the safest, a safer way of controlling your API and how you can manage changes throughout the lifetime of your API is to what they call namespace APIs. So this is really evident when you look at APIs that have like a v1, so say a slash API slash v1 or v2, or sometimes they use a year as the version. Whatever, you can use any kind of ID that you want, but the point being is that it's something that once a customer uses it, once it goes live and a customer starts using it, then you are restricted from making changes to that API, breaking changes to that API, and new things you want to put in, you have to go through a different namespace, a newer namespace. Okay, hopefully that made some sense. So let's, in our controllers folder, let's create another folder called API. And let's move the TodosController, into API. And then in the API folder, let's make another new folder. And we'll call it V1. And let's move Todos. I know this is kind of a slow way of moving our folders and files around, but it's just to kind of show you what's happening here. So we've got it within a V1 folder, and that's where we'll leave it. So what we need to do is then go into the controller in the editor. So TodosController, and we need to prepend this with an API : V1 : TodosController. And it is then inheriting from ApplicationController. And if we open up ApplicationController, it is actually inheriting from ActionController : API. So every API controller, every controller that we add to this project is eventually all inheriting from the base ActionController API object. Okay, so we've got this together. Now, what we also need to do is update the route file. So let's go into the, actually these are Control P for, I'm on Windows here, and go Routes.rb. And we've got our resources to-dos. So we also have to surround that with a namespace. So we do a namespace API, and then a namespace v1, and then a resources to-dos, and then an end. And then, of course, we have to put do statements around this. Okay, so then an end here, and then an additional end for that one. So that way we're reinforcing the /API/v1/todos. Now let's go back into let's look at our model. And our model is just a standard to-do model with that inherits from application record. So back in our controller, we should be able to support the four CRUD operations that I was talking about. So let's go into, let's just stub out these files for now, okay? So what we're going to do is we are going to be creating a def index. And this is the method that gets mapped to the getAll request or the root, the default root of /API/v1/todos. And basically what we want to do is just retrieve all of the to-do items. And then we want to render JSON to-dos. And then we've got a show function, and this maps to the read action, which is basically just get an individual to-do item. So here we're going to do a to-do equals find by params ID, and then just render JSON to-do. Okay, perfect. Then let's call the create for the post. So def create, and we want to do to-do equals to-do.new valid params. And then what we want to do is if to-do.save. So if we, after we create the new to-do item from the given parameters that we're sending in the post request, we'll attempt to save to the database. And if the save works, or if it's successful, then we'll render the new to-do item back to the browser, or back to the caller, sorry, with a status 200. Otherwise, we will render the errors. Okay, so status, sorry, let's use processable entity. So basically I can't remember the status code for that. 500? Something like that. Okay, so we've got to create, and let's do an update method to handle a put or patch. So def update, and let's again to-do ampersand at to-do equals to-do find params ID. And then let's, if we found the to-do, then to-do.update based on the given parameters that we are passing in the body. And then render, let's see, we can render a message back to the client. To-do updated with the status 200. Okay. Otherwise, if we can't find it, then let's render an error. Render JSON unable to update to-do. And we'll give that a status of 500. Some generic error. And then let's finally do a destroy for when we want to destroy, when we want to delete a to-do item. So let's call it def destroy. And let's do to-do equals to-do.find params ID that we're sending in the request. So if to-do.destroy, render JSON message to-do destroyed, and status 200, else render JSON with an error message of unable to destroy. I don't know, something like that. Status of 500. And that should be it for our actions. Oh, let's end that as well. Okay. So we've created the four or five methods which correspond to the the type of HTTP request that we want to be able to send to our API backend. Okay, so we have to-do items. We have them coming back. We have them exposed via the service. So let's go ahead, and we never ran the migration. So let's check out the migration before we run it. So in the DB migrate folder, we've got the new migration that we've created from our application generator. And so here we're creating a new to-dos table. We've got a title, a column named title using of type string. We've got a column named status, also a string. And we've got a is completed column type, which is a Boolean, or is completed column, which is a Boolean type, sorry. And the regular timestamps created at, updated at fields that Rails injects. So let's go ahead and run this. Let's go back to our thing here. So let's just type in Rails. We can do Rails DB migrate. And oh yeah, so let's not capitalize those. Let's leave those as all lowercase. So let's try that again. And hooray, we've created our to-dos table. So maybe let's get this checked in right here. So we've got our namespace updated. We've got our database, new migration, migrated. So let's create some seeds. Let's create a way of creating a seed lets you create a way of test data for your database, for your demo. That way you can have some data that's already in there when you need it, and then you can start working with it right away. You don't have to spend time generating, sort of inputting new data every single time. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to destroy all the existing to-do items. And this isn't something that runs every time you start up the Rails server. I'll show you how to execute this. This is only on a manual thing that you do on the command line. Okay, so to do, we want to destroy all, and then we'll make a small loop of 20. So 20 times what we want to do is create a new to-do. And so what we're going to be using is we're going to be using a gem called Faker, which basically is just a random generator. So we'll be using a random movie title. And then for status, we are going to, let's create a small status array here. And so for a status, we can have either started, backlog, or done. Of course, we can always generate more later. Those are kind of the ones I just came up with now. So we want to reference this new array, and we want to do a 1 plus random statuses count. So this will generate it'll pick a random status between the three here and tag that to our status column, okay? And then what we want to do is is completed. We want to randomize between true and false. So let's put true and false in an array and then use the sample function, which will pick a randomized true or false. So we're going to create that and then end. Let's end that. And then let's display something back to our console here. So we're going to puts created, and then we'll use the string interpolation, string count to do items. So on our terminal window, right now we have an empty database. We've just migrated the last migration of our to-dos. So our database is currently empty. So what we can do is type in Rails db:/seed, and it'll try and run that seeds file that we just updated and do whatever we want with the database. And it's all right, of course. So we've got to first add the Faker gem. So let's go into the Gemfile, and in the section where it says group development and test, we want to add the gem Faker. Yep, that's the only one we need to add for now. So let's go back to our command line and let's type in bundle install. We could have done a bundle add Faker, but just to show you how to update the gem file, you can go either or. So now let's run that Rails DB seed again. And it should go through and Oh my gosh. Whoops. Statuses count. So this should now work. Let's Rails DB seed again. And we've now created 20 to-do items. Okay, good. So if we do a Rails S, let's get that server up and running. If we then go into Postman, so let's use a path. Let's set up a GET request to API v1 to-dos. And as you can see, we've got, let's make this a whole lot bigger. So API/API/v1 to-dos. And let's even just get rid of what we're sending in the body. So we're not sending anything, no params, no headers, no authorization, or like we have the standard headers that Postman sends, but we're not sending anything special. And we should get back all 20 items from the to-do list. So as you can see, we've got, Dial M for murder. It's in the backlog and we're done with it. Pulp Fiction, Spirited Away. Once in a while, we get a status of null. Maybe we're not using the correct random generation, but this is just seed test data. So it's also good sometimes to have broken test data to see how your application handles it. So let's go with that and go back to our code. So we've got sort of the basic to-do operations done. Let's verify that we can post a new one. So let's post into to-dos and let's send in a title and we'll call it new to-do. Nice and creative. A status of backlog and a is completed false. And I've just realized that we forgot to set up one thing in our controller. So back in our to-dos controller, remember how we referenced this valid params. So now we've got to set up what those valid parameters actually are. And this lets us filter out and prevent garbage data from getting back to our controllers. So let's set up a private section and let's create a def valid params. And then let's go here and we'll say params require. So if we're sending a to-do object, we want to permit the title, the status, and the is completed. And that's it. So that's saved and now that's running. And let's go back to Postman here. So what we want to do is, again, we've set up a request to do a post to API v1 to-dos. And we are specifying a title, status, and is completed of false. So let's go ahead and run that one. And we get a successfully new item created. So we're given an item ID of 21 with the new title, status, and is completed flags. And then if we again request all of the to-do items, this should appear at the very bottom as number 21. All right. And then, so let's try and delete that. So let's do a delete request to API v1 to-dos /21. Let's just empty out the body there. And we get a message to do destroyed. And let's verify that with a get to all of them. And we should only see a count of 20, which we do. So that's pretty cool. So we've got kind of the basic CRUD operations already set up for our to-do items. So now what we want to do is we want to layer in the ability to handle accounts. And so this will force our API to require authentication before being able to access any of our items in our system. So right now, as you can see in our test, through Postman, we can access everything. We can touch everything. We can update everything. And this is kind of a terrible API because then anyone can do everything to your API or to your objects in your database, and you won't be able to track what's going on or keep it relative to an individual user that is making these requests. So let's go ahead and start changing that. So back to our, before I do that, I'm just going to set up to-dos. Okay, so we are going to be updating the Gemfile again. And this time, we are going to be referencing the Devise library, the Devise gem, sorry. And this is a library that's been built specifically for handling authorization, for different authorization methods for either your application or your API. So you know what? Let's do this on the command line. So let's do a bundle add Devise. And we also want to do a bundle add Devise token _ token _ auth. And so it'll set that up and update the Gemfile automatically with the versions we want to use. Let's quickly jump over to the documentation. So at the website, let's go down here. Let's scroll down here to the documentation. So on the website, we've got, let's see, is that legible? Okay, so we've added the gem to our gem file. We've bundled installed. Now what we want to do is, right here, geez, right underneath. Okay, so we want to hit the configuration section. Okay, so what we want to do is Rails G Devise token auth. Oh, is that too small? Okay, let's blow that up. Rails G Devise token auth install, and then a user class and a mount path. So user class is the name that we want to give the object that we'll be using for handling user information. So we can use user. That's no problem. We can use user, account, whatever it is that you want in your system. We'll stick with user just because that's kind of in the documentation and it might be easier to follow. And auth path is sort of the slash endpoint that all of these authentication and token endpoints will be listening to. So let's go into our console here and let's type in Rails generate Devise token auth install, and we don't want the Mongoid. We want this one here. Okay, so user class is just user, and the auth path, the mount path is going to be /API/v1/auth. I decided to keep it namespaced as well because I don't know if in the future, if you, let's say for example, you wanted to add OAuth support into your API. So again, we've created, or the generator will create it'll create an initializer Ruby file for us. It's updating the application controller. It's going to be updating the routes, which we'll look at in a second. It's created a new migration, and it's created a new user for us called, a new model for us called user. So let's go check all these things out. Let's first go into the migration. And so we've got a provider and UID. We can leave all of this as is. We will have to make some, so I commented out the confirmable section of columns. And then down here for user info, we don't need any of this stuff. All we need is email. So let's go ahead and comment out name, nickname, and image. Maybe you want to add support for that in the future. Go nuts. But let's leave it with just an email, and the rest should be the same. We don't need the index for a confirmation token. I think that's all of the, yep, that's all the fields that we want to support. And let's jump to our user model and check that out. So we've got a basic device actions set up here, along with the new, or an updated module which has methods from this Devise token auth concern. So let's first clean these up. So we're registerable, we're recoverable, rememberable, validatable, and that's all we have to work with. That's all we have to worry about. We don't need to be confirmable. Remember how we took that out of the migration. Okay, so we've got this set up here. Now let's check out the application controller. So we want to include the set users by token Okay, we want to include the device token auth concerns set users by token, and that's set up by the generator. I'm just pointing out that it's here. The other thing we want to do while we're here, now that we're in this section, is we want to set up a default response type of JSON. And to do that, all we have to do is set up a respond to JSON attribute here. Yeah, if we set this here, then basically in all of our responses will be JSON by default, which will really help out when we want to set up error codes and basically output back to the user. Okay, so we've got this set up, and now let's look at our routes and our Routes.rb file. And let's see what got added. So the generator added this section here, mount device token auth for user at API v1 auth, which is great. So we've got everything set up. The last thing we need to do is set up in the TodosController. Where is our TodosController? Control P, TodosController. We now want to set up at the very top. We want to set up a callback. Before action, we want to authenticate the account because we want to lock down access to the to-dos with a valid authenticated account that we're passing in from this token authentication. And right now, we don't have any references between the user account and the to-do items. So if you don't have that in your API, let's say, for example, you're building an API where you only have to worry about being authenticated to use the API, but then everything is separate from an actual user. Like let's say we've got a movie listing API where we're not the user doesn't create any new movies, but we're just like, let's say it's an online IMDb, a publicly accessible IMDb service. We want the ability we want the users to be able to authenticate in order to access the service. But then if we don't allow any creates through this, like basically any update, like if it's a read-only service, then we don't need any interaction, or not interaction, we don't need any references made between the user model and the movie model. So right now we haven't formed any link, any reference between the to-dos and the user. So when all that we're guarding right now is that our current user account has to be authenticated. And that's all we need to access the same to-dos that we've been accessing already. That was a real mouthful. Okay, let's go back to the command line here and let's finally run this migration. We've checked everything out. Everything looks good. And let's check out the device token auth initializer. Let's check that out quickly here. Control P, device. Okay, and this is basically just a bunch of options that we can set on this. And we don't really need, the only one I needed to add for working with this is a config default confirm success URL of nil. When you use this gem and you make a request for creating when you're registering a new account, then through the API, then you're also needing to pass in sort of a success URL that will then get triggered once the user gets registered into the system. And so this is helpful if you've got like a sign up on a different website somewhere. And while I was talking, I remembered something else that we have to activate, but we'll do that in its own section. So let's go back to the terminal window here. And let's run this migration. So Rails DB migrate. So the one step that we forgot to take when we added the device gems is we forgot to run the device install. So we ran the device token auth install, but not the device install. So we just need to type in Rails G device install. And let's temporarily comment out the mount device token auth. Let's see, in the User RB model, let's temporarily comment out these lines. And then let's go back and type in Rails G Devise install. So we're using an API, so we don't need to update anything. We don't need to make any of these updates that the Rails, the default device generator gives us. So let's go back and let's uncomment what we commented out. So let's see, where's the route? Sorry about that, everyone. Did everything in the wrong order. Okay, sometimes it happens. And then we've got that set up. Okay, and then let's go back and go back to the generator, or not to, let's go back to the terminal and let's run the actual migration. And everything works. Okay, so we now have got the new everything migrated. Let's add this to Git. So we've got quite a few things set up for us already. So now let's go ahead and everything looks good here. So let's go ahead and start up our server again. Rails S. And let's go back into Postman. And so if we do a get API v1 to-dos again. Okay, so it says undefined method authenticate account. So what we want to do, I'm sorry. I know exactly what it is. So authenticate user, thinking account when I was creating this. Okay, so we're going to authenticate the user before, we've got a before action callback, and we want to authenticate the user. We want to call authenticate user because this verb here, or this noun, sorry, this noun matches what we're using for our user account. So if our user account was called account, then this would be authenticate underscore account. But since we're using a user, then this is authenticate underscore user. So let's try making that request again. And now we get a default error message of you need to sign in or sign up before continuing. So far, so good. Okay. So now what we need to do is let's go ahead and stop this. And let's go back into our seed file, because what we need to do is create a new user. That way we can test. We can test with the user. So let's do user destroy all. And let's right under stat, it doesn't really matter where, but right under here, we can do a user1 equals user.create. And let's give it an email of user at, let's just call it user1, user1 at user.com with a password of password and a password confirmation password, and then a password confirmation of password. And that's all we need. Okay, so user1 gets created. So let's see, how about here? Puts created, and let's give a user1 dot email user. How about this? Created user, and then put we'll string interpolate the user1 dot email. And let's go back into the terminal window, and then let's do a Rails DB seed again. So it'll destroy everything and recreate it. So we've created 20 new to-do items, and we've got a new user, user1 at user.com. So let's go ahead and run this again. Rails S. And then let's go back into Postman and let's do a get. And it'll say you need to sign in or sign up before continuing. So let's sign in. So let's do a post request to API v1 auth sign in. And in the body, let's send email of user1 at user.com and a password of password. And let's send that across. And we get invalid credentials. 401 unauthorized, invalid credentials. Oh, sorry. User1. We now get a response of our account that we're trying to log in with, sign in with. Let's go to the headers, and we see that we've already got a bearer authorization header. So let's see which ones are. So some of these are added by the Devise User Token gem. This is one of them, this UID. And so this is basically the user identifier that we're using in our API. And right now it's the default one, which is the actual email that we're using to help authenticate the user account. So it's user1@user.com, and it would, of course, update depending on whatever we're logging in with. There's an expiry setup, and there's a token type. So there's different token types that we can set up for authentication, and the default one that we want to be using is a bearer token for our own API. But the HTTP header that we care about most in the response is this authorization header, because this is what we're going to need to use to include in all of our requests going forward with this account. So let's open up another tab, and we'll do a HTTP localhost 3000 API v1 to-dos. And then let's be sure to use in the headers here, let's use the authorization header, authorization, and then the token, and let's hit send. And we now get our to-do items back. Excellent. So again, if our API was just responsible for handling authentication separate from the actual objects or resources that we want to call from the API, then we're on a good path. But in this API, what I want to set up is a reference between the to-do item and the user account. So let's go back into our terminal window. And now let's set up a migration. So let's set up a new migration here. And what we're going to do is create a reference between the user and the to-do item. Okay, what I want to do is Rails generate migration, add user to to-do, add user to to-do, and so it'll create a new migration for us, which will open up here. And in the change method, what we want to do is add a reference into the to-dos table from user, null being false, and it is a foreign key. So foreign key true. So this in the database sets up basically a user.id column in every to-do. So what we want to do is go back into the user model, the include module file. What we can do is type in a has many to-dos and dependent destroy. So each user can have one-to-many to-dos associated with it. And then in the to-do model, all we have to do is make sure we have a belongs to user. Okay, and then what we can do is run this migration. First, what we need to do is, because we've got an existing table, some existing records, Rails DB :reset, it drops the existing database, recreates them like empty, and then it tells us that we've got one pending migration. So let's go ahead and run that migration. So Rails DB migrate, which will add that reference between the users and to-do. Okay, so now we've got user ID column set up in the to-do. So back in the seeds file, let's update that to make sure that we're attaching our user to the user one. So what we can also do here is let's create two users just to have a little bit of randomization here. So user two create equals user.create, and let's give it an email of user2@user.com with a password of password and a password confirmation of password. And then what we can do is in the user field here, we can put user1 and user2 in an array, and then type in and then call the .sample method. So basically, it'll randomly choose between user1 or user2 to be the owner of that to-do item. Okay, and then let's update the puts here. Created user2.email. Okay, so everything looks all right. We ran the migration. So let's go ahead and call Rails DB seed again. And everything should be updating. Okay, good. So created user, generated the 2 users, generated the to-do items with references to those users. So now what we need to do is we need to make sure, if you remember in our TodosController, in our main index, in our main GET request, we're just fetching all of the to-do items. So we want to be able to filter that down to only the to-do items that match, that correspond to the current user that's logged in. So let's go back into our models, into our to-do model, sorry. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a scope. So a scope is, if you haven't seen one before, is kind of a helper function for querying the object type that you're creating the scope for. Maybe it'll become more easier to understand as we create one. So let's call this one by user. And this one is going to be a lambda function, which is basically we want to pass a function. It'll execute this function when we reference this scope. So what we want to do is create a where clause where the user ID of the to-do matches the given user.id. So now let's go back into our controller and let's do a to-dos by user, current user, and then render these to-do items. And then similarly, when we want to find a parameter, what we want to do is pass in the scope. So by user, current user, and then find the given ID parameter. So let's update this one down here. By underscore user, current user, dot find, by underscore user, current user, dot find. And all right. So now what we can do is let's create another helper function, which kind of cleans up some of this work that we're doing here. So let's create another callback of before action. So after the authenticate the user, and let's call this one set to do. Now, since we're only using this find with parameters ID on certain methods, let's restrict this set to do callback to do that. So we only want to use this on, let's give it a list here, on show, update, and destroy. So let's go down here and create a set to do. And this is where we can do a to do equals an instance variable of to do, an instance variable of to do by user, current user, dot find params ID. And then let's put a little bit of error handling in here. So just to help out our API here, because what we want to do is be able to send back a proper message if we can't find the to-do item that we want to look for, not work for. So usually when there's an error in find, then Rails will throw an active record not found. So if we're rescuing it, so basically it's basically the Ruby version of try catch. So we want to rescue this error, and then what we want to do is be able to respond back to the browser, error unable to find to do, and then we want to give it a status of 404. So let's clean up this a little bit, make it a little bit easier to read. Okay, so now if we've called set, the set callback before show update and destroy, we could then get rid of this line altogether and show, because we're calling what we want to do here. For update, we can get rid of that as well. And for destroy, we can get rid of this line as well. And so we're doing it all in set to do. Okay, so let's try this out. Let's go back to our command line here. Oops. Let's go back to our command line here. Okay, and let's do a Rails S. We've started the server. We've run our migration, created our seed file. Let's go back into Postman and let's do a sign in of user 1. Okay, and then let's get the authorization tag, authorization header, sorry. And let's go back into our get to-dos tab. And let's get all the to-dos, and we'll update our authorization header to be the one we just got. Hit send. And now we get our updated list of to-dos back, which are filtered down to just our user ID. And then let's go ahead and let's grab an individual one. Let's grab number 20, 15. Let's grab number 15. So the same header should work. And we get the record that we're looking to get. And then let's say we want to delete this one. So let's update this to delete request method. And hopefully we can, okay. Sometimes I found that you have to sign in between some of the requests that you send it. So let's go ahead and sign in again and steal the authorization header here. And let's go back into our delete, update that, and send it across. And we get to do item destroyed. Now let's also do a get request. Let's test out that 404 error handling. And well, we just deleted the 15 once, so we can either try and reference that one, or let's just give it a really high number. And we've got a unable to find to do. Awesome. This is really cool. So now another thing we want to set up is the ability to handle cores. So right now, if we try and access our API from another machine on our network, let's say I fire up my Raspberry Pi and I set this API server on that, and then I start making requests from this machine over to the Raspberry Pi. By default, Rails API has built-in cores protection. So cross-origin resource sharing, I think that's what it stands for. So that essentially means that it's a security measure to prevent requests coming from other machines other than the one the server is running on. So we want to be able to, most APIs out there, you can set up restrictions and security for proper domain handling. So maybe you want to lock it down. You know what, let me open it first before I keep talking. So let's go back into our Gemfile. And what we're going to need to do is uncomment the gem rack cores. And so basically this will resource sharing. I was right. Okay, good. So this enables you to configure cores so that anyone can make a request from anywhere, even if they're not on the same domain that your server is running on. So let's do a bundle install. And then let's go into the cores initializer, config initializers. And all we've got to do is uncomment this handler that's already stubbed out and defined here. And we just need to replace the origins of example.com to origin star. Now, there's a lot of security people out there kind of going, freaking out about that. And, for good measure, because we what we want to do is, and also, of course, according to the configuration for the device token auth gem, we also need to expose a few headers here. So we need to expose the access token, the expiry, the token type, the UID, and the, I believe, authorization. Or no, just the client. Authorization will be exposed by default. Okay, so back to what I was saying. When you try to make a API call, what your browser will do is it'll first try and send a what's called a pre-flight request. So a pre-flight request gets sent to the server, basically just asking, do I have permission to run this call, to make this API call? So you make the browser will make this pre-flight request, and then the server will respond with what origin are you making this request from? And so if this origins filter is defined here, like let's say yahoo.com, let's say our allowed origins are yahoo.com. So if you are making a request from yahoo.com, then the pre-flight request will succeed because the server sees that it's an allowed origin, and then your request is coming from that origin. So it will allow it through, and then you can go on your merry way and do whatever AJAX calls you want to make through the API, through JavaScript, Python, any web language. Now, when your origin doesn't match what's in the allowed list, so let's say it's on yahoo.com, but you are making the call from microsoft.com, then the core's pre-flight check will fail, and you won't be able to make that request. There's a lot of different ways to mitigate this. So you can keep an origin. So let's say we're running behind Yahoo infrastructure. So we can lock our origin down to yahoo.com, but then expose our API through other means that before we get to where this server is being run. So other network infrastructure that we can open up security on. And this allows us to mitigate some attacks, mitigate some network load. So there are different ways of going around this problem. But with our API, we are just going to allow everything, allow all origins. So we're running on, let's say I set this up on my Raspberry Pi, or you set it up on your Raspberry Pi in your own network. You get it up and running, and then you can make calls from any other machine in your network, or your phone, or your iPad, whatever devices you have. And so then this is a way of allowing calls from any device, from any origin. Okay. So we can type in Rails S again, but we know it works, so we know this is set up. I don't have an easy way to share a screen from another device, so it's kind of difficult to check origin, the origin check here. But we're going to go with the assumption that this will work and that any domain can make the request. So Swagger is a way of documenting your API, and it's almost like self-documenting, for lack of an easier way to describe it. So basically, you can set up a way for Swagger to crawl through your API, and then it creates an automatic sort of documentation layout that you can then expose from your API. So, most APIs, when you want to work with them, they have developer docs. Stripe, Instagram, Pinterest, any API you want to work with on the internet, they all have sort of developer documentation that you can go through to analyze and check out what is supported on their through their API. So what we can do is we can use a gem called rswag. So let's go back into the gem file. And in the development test section, we're going to need to add a few more. We're going to need to add the rspec Rails and the gem rswag specs. And then down underneath the gem device token auth, we just need to add a gem rswag. We can even do if we drop to the terminal, we can do a bundle add rswag. And so it will go through and update all of our, let's do a bundle install just to make sure. Oh no, I see it there. Using rswag UI and rswag specs. Okay, so then what we need to do is let's double check swagger.io, GitHub repo for rswag, and let's just make sure that we've gone through the existing steps. Okay, so we've added the gem, and then let's run the install generator. So let's drop to the command line, terminal window, sorry, and let's type in Rails g rswag install. So this will set up a config, some config stuff. It'll set up a default route of API docs, which we can leave as that for now. And then what we can do is set up a request spec for our to-dos, for the item that we're trying, or the method that we want to expose through the API. Okay. So let's go into specs. We've got a Swagger helper there. Oh, we also need to do an rspec. Let's do that. And we need to do, I believe, an rspec. Is it an install? Okay, maybe just rspec init. I swear I've called rspec install, but let's do rspec init. Okay, and it's created the spec helper for us. Perfect. That's what I was looking for. And then let's go back into, we're in the spec folder now. And then let's create a file in there called TodosSpec.rb. Okay, and then let's TodosSpec.rb. So what we want to do is we want to require the Swagger helper. And then we want to describe the Todos API. And then let's set up a path of API v1 Todos do. So let's see, the post request creates a to-do. And let's give it a tags name of to-dos. I don't know you can, that'll change depending on the documentation you want to show. So let's give it a tags of to-do. So we want to, it consumes application JSON. And let's see, parameters. Let's give it a parameter. So we've got a name to-do. And then we've got an in body and then a schema which matches our parameters. Let's do, it's an object that we're allowing, and we have properties for that object where we have a title of type string. And then we have a status also of type string. And then we have an is completed of type Boolean. And then our required fields. We haven't set any up, but let's set up one now. Let's set up that title is required. And then underneath here, let's do a response 201 when it's created. Whoops. To do created, do let to do title new to do. And this will be easier to see what's going on right after we run this. Run test. And then let's run an error condition. So response 422 invalid request do let to do and then let's leave out the title. So let's just have a is completed false. So we've left out the title, run test, end, and one more end. Okay. So we've defined title as a requirement of to-dos. So let's go back in our to-dos model. And let's now add a validation section. And let's validates presence of title. So now we won't be able to create a to-do item without a title, with an empty title. So let's go ahead and now we can run, let me just make sure I get the command right that we run. Okay, so once we're done setting up our spec, which kind of documents our API documentation, it helps document our documentation, we then need to run rake rswag specs swaggerize, or rake rswag. So let's go to the terminal and let's type in rake rswag. Okay, so we've generated the Swagger documentation. So it says here that Swagger documentation at docs generated at blah path. So then let's do a Rails server. And then we can go into the browser. And let's do a 3000/API docs. And ta-da, we get our beautiful new Swagger documentation of our to-do endpoint. And right now, the only one we documented, just as an example, is the post API. So let's unroll that. And so we've got our request URL, our name of creating a to-do, and then we've got our request body, which is a title status and is completed, with title being a required value. And then we've got some responses laid out here. So this is helpful for when you're working through APIs and different error handling and different ways to call that API. So that's really cool. That's a great, easy way to specify your API, get it documented for when you want to publish for consumers to use the API. I think that's about all I wanted to cover in this intro to creating your own API. I think that gives us a really good bed, a really good place to start things from. You've got some core security set up. You've got a basic way of calling an API through token authentication, as well as handle any domain you want through cores. And we've also done some preliminary documentation generation with that, which I think is pretty cool. There's a lot more intermediate, advanced topics that we can pour into our API, but I think in terms of a simple project, this is a really great place to start from. I hope you had a lot of fun. I hope you had as much of a good time as I did putting this together. I really want to thank you for watching this far. If you've made it here, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below on if this helped you or not, or if there's something else that you're looking for in terms of working with APIs and/or authentication. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video, everyone. Peace.